The steel beast emerged from the morning fog like a predator stalking its prey. Soviet infantrymen, crouched in their frozen trenches outside Prokhorovka in July 1943, watched in horror as the massive silhouette took shape. It was a German Tiger tank, and its 88mm gun was already traversing toward their position. One soldier, a young private named Alexei Romanov, would later recall that moment in his diary. "We thought we were looking at death itself, painted in dark gray and moving with the certainty of a machine that knew it was invincible." Within seconds, the Tiger's cannon roared, and the Russian anti-tank gun position to Alexei's left simply ceased to exist in a shower of earth and twisted metal. But this wasn't the end of Alexei's story, nor was it the end of the Tiger's dominance on the Eastern Front. What happened next would reveal a truth about tank warfare that military historians are still analyzing today, and it involves not just one mechanical monster, but an entire cast of armored titans that would reshape how wars were fought forever. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover about these 10 killing machines will change everything you thought you knew about World War II. Before we dive into the carnage these metal beasts created, let me ask you something. What makes a tank truly deadly? Is it the thickness of its armor, the power of its gun, or something else entirely? Most people assume it's firepower, but they're only partially right. The deadliest tanks of World War II combined multiple factors: psychological impact, mechanical reliability, tactical flexibility, and yes, the ability to destroy everything in their path. The Tiger tank that Alexei faced that morning had all of these qualities, but so did 9 other machines that prowled the battlefields of Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Some of these tanks you've heard of, others have been lost to history, overshadowed by more famous cousins. But each one earned its place on this list through blood, steel, and the terrifying mathematics of modern warfare. Let's rewind to where it all began, because you can't understand why these tanks were so deadly without understanding what came before them. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, tanks were still relatively new weapons, evolutionary descendants of the lumbering machines that had crawled across the mud of World War I. But the Germans had learned something crucial. Tanks weren't just mobile artillery, they were the tip of the spear, the breakthrough weapon that could shatter enemy lines when used in concentrated formations. This doctrine, which would become known as Blitzkrieg, required tanks that were fast, reliable, and numerous. The early German Panzer IIs and IIIs were decent machines, but they weren't the monsters that would later terrorize Allied forces. No, those would come later, born from the harsh lessons learned in the frozen Russian steppes and the desert sands of North Africa. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, had been quietly developing its own armored philosophy. In the 1930s, Soviet tank designers were obsessed with one concept, the universal tank, that could fulfill multiple roles. This thinking led to some brilliant innovations and some catastrophic failures. But in 1940, a new design rolled out of a Kharkov factory that would change everything. It was called the T-34. And when German forces first encountered it in the summer of 1941 during Operation Barbarossa, their reaction was one of genuine shock. A German tank commander named Paul Huber wrote in his report, "Our shells simply bounce off them at all normal combat ranges. The 37mm and 50mm guns are inadequate against this tank." The T-34 had sloped armor, a revolutionary design feature that made incoming shells more likely to deflect rather than penetrate. It had a powerful 76mm gun that could destroy any German tank of that period. And perhaps most importantly, it was simple enough to be mass-produced and maintained by crews with minimal training. This last point cannot be overstated, because war is ultimately a numbers game, and the T-34 would be produced in staggering quantities. But let me take you to a specific moment that illustrates why the T-34 earned its place among the deadliest tanks. It's October 1941, near the town of Mtsensk, southwest of Moscow. A German Panzer division was advancing confidently, having swept aside Soviet resistance for months. Then, without warning, a brigade of T-34s commanded by Colonel Mikhail Katukov struck from concealed positions. The German tanks, Panzer IIIs and IVs mostly, found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered. German General Heinz Guderian, one of the fathers of Blitzkrieg, personally inspected knocked-out T-34s after this battle and was disturbed by what he found. In his memoirs, he admitted that the T-34 was superior to any German tank then in service. This wasn't propaganda or exaggeration. This was one of Germany's finest military minds acknowledging that his opponents had built a better weapon. The T-34 would go on to be produced in numbers exceeding 84,000 units, making it not just deadly in individual combat, but overwhelmingly so in aggregate. Soviet crews loved it, despite its cramped interior and poor visibility. Why? Because it kept them alive while killing enemy tanks, and in war, that's all that really matters. The Germans, however, weren't going to accept technological inferiority. In response to the T-34 shock, German engineers began work on two projects that would become legendary: the Panther and the Tiger. Let's focus on the Panther first, because in many ways it represents the perfect synthesis of German engineering philosophy: powerful, sophisticated, and tragically over-engineered. The Panther, designated as the Panzerkampfwagen V, entered production in 1943 and was essentially Germany's answer to the T-34. It had sloped armor like the Soviet tank, but thicker. It mounted a long-barreled 75mm gun that could penetrate the armor of any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. It was fast, capable of nearly 50 kilometers per hour on roads. On paper, it was the perfect tank. In reality, it was a maintenance nightmare. Early Panthers suffered from engine fires, transmission failures, and final drive problems that left them stranded on battlefields across Europe. But when they worked, and they did work after the initial problems were addressed, they were absolutely devastating. Picture this scene. It's June 1944, shortly after D-Day, and a British armored column is advancing through the Norman hedgerows. British tankers were mostly equipped with Sherman tanks, reliable American machines that were nevertheless outclassed by German armor. A Sherman's 75mm gun could barely penetrate a Panther's frontal armor, while a Panther could destroy a Sherman from distances where British crews couldn't even effectively return fire. A British tank commander named David Render later described the feeling of encountering a Panther. You felt naked, exposed, like you were driving a coffin and the lid was about to slam shut. This wasn't cowardice. This was the rational fear of men who understood that the machine hunting them was technologically superior in nearly every way. Allied forces developed tactics to counter Panthers, usually involving flanking maneuvers to hit the thinner side armor. But these tactics required multiple tanks to take down one Panther, and the kill ratio reflected this harsh mathematics. Despite production of only about 6,000 Panthers, they accounted for a disproportionate number of Allied tank kills. That's the Deadly. Now let's talk about the tank that appeared at the beginning of our story, the Tiger. If the Panther was Germany's answer to the T-34, the Tiger was Germany's statement of dominance, a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. The Tiger I, officially the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger Ausf E, was introduced in 1942 and immediately established itself as the most feared tank on any battlefield. With frontal armor up to 100 millimeters thick and an 88mm gun derived from the famous anti-aircraft and anti-tank gun, the Tiger could destroy any Allied tank from the front while being nearly impervious to return fire. A single Tiger could hold an entire sector of front line, and Allied commanders learned to respect and fear the distinctive sound of its Maybach engine. The Tiger had its weaknesses. It was slow, mechanically unreliable, fuel-hungry, and expensive to produce. Germany only built about 1,347 Tigers, but their impact far exceeded their numbers. Let me tell you about Michael Whitman, because you can't discuss the Tiger without mentioning the man who became his most famous commander. On June 13, 1944, near the French town of Villers-Bocage, Whitman was leading a handful of Tigers when he spotted a British armored column stretched out along a road. What happened next became one of the most dramatic tank engagements of the entire war. Whitman, in a single Tiger, charged into the column alone. In 15 minutes of savage combat, he destroyed approximately 14 tanks, 15 personnel carriers, and 2 anti-tank guns. The British column, which had been confidently advancing, was thrown into complete chaos. Whitman's Tiger prowled through the town like an apex predator, its gun barking methodically as it picked apart vehicles that couldn't flee and couldn't fight back effectively. Eventually, British forces rallied, and Whitman withdrew, but the damage was done both physically and psychologically. This was the Tiger's true power: one tank, one commander, creating disproportionate destruction. Whitman himself would be killed 2 months later, but his legacy cemented the Tiger's reputation as perhaps the most individually deadly tank of the war. But deadliness isn't just about individual duels or dramatic engagements. Sometimes it's about being the right tool for a specific job, which brings us to a tank most people have never heard of: the Soviet IS-2. While the T-34 was the workhorse of the Red Army, the IS-2 was its battering ram. Standing for Joseph Stalin, the IS-2 entered service in 1943 and was designed with one primary purpose: to crack open German heavy armor and fortifications. It mounted a massive 122mm gun that fired shells weighing 25 kilograms. This wasn't just a tank gun, it was essentially a siege weapon mounted on tracks. The IS-2 couldn't fire as rapidly as other tanks. Its gun required two-piece ammunition that slowed the loading process. But when it hit something, that something ceased to exist. German tank crews reported that a direct hit from an IS-2 could tear the turret completely off a Tiger tank. Think about that for a moment. A shell so powerful it could rip apart the most feared tank in the German arsenal. The IS-2 saw action throughout the final battles of the Eastern Front and during the assault on Berlin. Soviet crews loved it because it gave them the confidence to go toe-to-toe with Tigers and Panthers, something the T-34 struggled with. A Soviet IS-2 commander named Alexander Burda recounted an engagement near the Oder River in early 1945, where his tank faced 3 German Panthers. The Panthers, recognizing the threat, fired first, but their shots either bounced off the IS-2's thick frontal armor or caused only minor damage. Burda's gunner, however, destroyed all 3 Panthers with 4 shots. One Panther took 2 hits before it stopped burning. This was the IS-2's deadliness: not subtlety, not speed, but overwhelming firepower that could defeat any opponent. The Soviets produced about 3,800 IS-2s, and they served not just in World War II, but for decades afterward, a testament to the fundamental soundness of the design. Let's shift theaters now, because the war wasn't just fought in Europe. In the Pacific, tank warfare took on a different character. The Japanese, who had started the war with tanks like the Type 95 Hago that were adequate for fighting in China but hopelessly outclassed against American armor, never developed a truly world-class tank. But the Americans did, and their medium tank, the M4 Sherman, deserves its place on this list for reasons that might surprise you. The Sherman wasn't the most powerful tank, it wasn't the most heavily armored, and it certainly wasn't the most feared by enemy tankers. But it was reliable, it was produced in enormous quantities, over 50,000 units, and it could be adapted for dozens of specialized roles. More importantly, it was good enough for the job it was designed to do: support infantry, fight other medium tanks, and be easily repairable in field conditions. Here's why the Sherman was deadly in a way that transcends simple statistics. It was part of a system. American doctrine didn't rely on individual tank duels. It relied on combined arms warfare, where tanks worked in coordination with infantry, artillery, air support, and logistics. A Sherman might lose a one-on-one fight with a Panther, but Shermans rarely fought alone. They came in groups, supported by fighter bombers and artillery that could suppress enemy positions. And critically, when a Sherman was knocked out, it could often be recovered and repaired. German tanks, by contrast, were frequently abandoned when they broke down, because German logistics couldn't keep pace with the advancing Soviet or Allied forces. A German tank ace named Otto Carius wrote bitterly after the war about watching operational Panthers and Tigers being blown up by their own crews because they'd run out of fuel or spare parts. The Sherman's deadliness was cumulative, systematic, and ultimately decisive. By 1945, Sherman tanks were present at every major American and British offensive in Europe and the Pacific, and their sheer ubiquity meant they accounted for an enormous number of enemy vehicles and fortifications destroyed. Now I want to tell you about a tank that existed in tiny numbers but had an outsized reputation: the Tiger II, also known as the King Tiger. If the Tiger I was feared, the Tiger II was mythological. First deployed in 1944, it was the ultimate expression of German heavy tank development. Frontal armor up to 180 millimeters thick, and 88 millimeter gun even more powerful than the one mounted on the Tiger I, and a design philosophy that said, "We don't care if it's practical, we want it invincible." In many ways, it achieved that goal. Allied tankers reported that their guns literally could not penetrate a Tiger II from the front at any practical combat range. The only way to kill one was to maneuver to its sides or rear, call in artillery, or use fighter bombers. But there were never very many of them. Only 492 were built, and they suffered from the same problems that plagued all late-war German armor: mechanical unreliability, lack of fuel, and expensive to produce. Germany only built about 1,347 Tiger Is, but their impact far exceeded their numbers. Let me tell you about Michael Wittmann, because you can't discuss the Tiger without mentioning the man who became its most famous commander. On June 13, 1944, near the French town of Villers-Bocage, Wittmann was leading a handful of Tigers when he spotted a British armored column stretched out along a road. What happened next became one of the most dramatic tank engagements of the entire war. Wittmann, in a single Tiger, charged into the column alone. In 15 minutes of savage combat, he destroyed approximately 14 tanks, 15 personnel carriers, and 2 anti-tank guns. The British column, which had been confidently advancing, was thrown into complete chaos. Wittmann's Tiger prowled through the town like an apex predator, its gun barking methodically as it picked apart vehicles that couldn't flee and couldn't fight back effectively. Eventually, British forces rallied, and Wittmann withdrew, but the damage was done, both physically and psychologically. This was the Tiger's true power: one tank, one commander, creating disproportionate destruction. Wittmann himself would be killed 2 months later, but his legacy cemented the Tiger's reputation as perhaps the most individually deadly tank of the war. But deadliness isn't just about individual duels or dramatic engagements. Sometimes it's about being the right tool for a specific job, which brings us to a tank most people have never heard of: the Soviet IS-2. While the T-34 was the workhorse of the Red Army, the IS-2 was its battering ram. Standing for Joseph Stalin, the IS-2 entered service in 1943 and was designed with one primary purpose: to crack open German heavy armor and fortifications. It mounted a massive 122 millimeter gun that fired shells weighing 25 kilograms. This wasn't just a tank gun, it was essentially a siege weapon mounted on tracks. The IS-2 couldn't fire as rapidly as other tanks. Its gun required two-piece ammunition that slowed the loading process. But when it hit something, that something ceased to exist. German tank crews reported that a direct hit from an IS-2 could tear the turret completely off a Tiger tank. Think about that for a moment. A shell so powerful it could rip apart the most feared tank in the German arsenal. The Churchill's deadliness was in its staying power and versatility. It could carry massive bunker-busting mortars, flamethrowers that could clear fortifications, and later in the war, it received better guns that made it more competitive. About 7,300 Churchills were built, and they served in every theater where British forces fought. A British Churchill commander named Bill Close described fighting in Italy. "Jerry would hit us again and again, and we'd just keep coming. They couldn't believe it. We'd lose road wheels, take hits to the hull, but the Churchill would keep moving." That psychological effect, knowing you're fighting a tank that won't stop, that's worth as much as a bigger gun. This encapsulates the Churchill's place among the deadliest tanks. It wasn't the most powerful, but it was relentless. And in war, relentlessness can be its own form of lethality. Finally, we come to perhaps the most controversial entry on this list, the Soviet T-34-85. Wait, you might be thinking, didn't we already talk about the T-34? Yes, but the T-34-85 was a significant upgrade that deserves separate recognition. By 1944, the original T-34 with its 76mm gun was struggling against improved German armor. Soviet designers responded by mounting an 85mm gun in a larger turret, creating a tank that could engage Panthers and Tigers more effectively while retaining all the reliability and mobility that made the T-34 family so successful. The T-34-85 entered production in early 1944 and was immediately rushed to the front. It became the standard Soviet medium tank for the remainder of the war and for decades afterward, eventually serving in conflicts from Korea to the Middle East. The T-34-85's deadliness came from combining the T-34's best qualities: reliability, mobility, sloped armor, ease of production, with a gun powerful enough to threaten any German tank. It wasn't as powerful as an IS-2, it wasn't as heavily armored as a Churchill, but it was good enough for almost any situation, and could be produced in staggering numbers. Soviet factories churned out about 50,000 T-34-85s during and after World War II. In the great offensives of 1944 and 1945, waves of T-34-85s rolled westward, overwhelming German defenses through sheer numerical superiority backed by adequate quality. A German defender at the Battle of Bagration in June 1944 described the scene. "They just kept coming, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. You'd knock out 10 and 20 more would appear. It was like trying to stop the tide." This was the T-35's true power, being good enough everywhere, all the time. So where does this leave us? We've journeyed through the development of armor warfare, from the shocking debut of the T-34 to the technological apex of the Tiger II, from the reliable ubiquity of the Sherman to the bunker-breaking power of the Su-152. Each of these tanks was deadly in its own way, some through technological superiority, some through numbers, some through psychological impact, and some through sheer stubbornness. The Tiger could kill any opponent, but was too rare and unreliable to change the war's outcome. The T-34 and Sherman were individually less impressive, but collectively decisive. The Panther was potentially the best all-around tank of the war, but arrived too late and in too few numbers. The IS-2 could crack any nut, but was expensive and slow to produce. Each tank tells a story about the nation that built it and the strategic situation it faced. Remember Alexei Romanov, the Soviet soldier we met at the beginning, watching that Tiger emerge from the fog? His story didn't end there. After surviving that initial encounter, Alexei was eventually assigned to a T-34-85 crew in 1944. He fought from Ukraine to Poland to Germany, and his tank was knocked out 3 times. Each time he survived, and each time he was given a new tank, because Soviet industry could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. In a letter to his sister after the war, Alexei wrote something profound. The Germans had better tanks, everyone knew it. But we had more tanks, and more importantly, we had more tankisti, tankers. In the end, that's what mattered. He was right. The deadliest tank wasn't necessarily the most powerful. It was the one that showed up when it mattered, where it mattered, in numbers that mattered. This is the ultimate lesson of tank warfare in World War II. Tactical excellence matters, technological superiority matters, but strategic reality matters most. The Germans built magnificent tanks that couldn't be produced in sufficient quantities or kept supplied in the field. The Soviets and Americans built adequate tanks that could be mass-produced, maintained, and replaced. The British built stubborn tanks that matched their strategic needs and national character. Each approach had its deadliness, each approach claimed its victims, but only one approach won the war. The E-34, the Panther, the Tiger I, the IS-2, the Sherman, the Tiger II, the Su-152, the Pershing, the Churchill, and the T-34-85 represent the peak of World War II armor development. They fought in every major battle from 1941 to 1945, they killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers, they destroyed countless vehicles and fortifications, and they changed warfare forever. Modern main battle tanks are direct descendants of these machines, inheriting their lessons. Mobility matters, firepower matters, protection matters, but most of all, being there matters. The deadliest tank is the one that shows up. If you found this journey through armored history fascinating, if these stories of steel and courage moved you or taught you something new, consider subscribing to see more content like this. These machines and the men who fought in them deserve to be remembered, their lessons studied, and their sacrifices honored. Drop a comment below about which tank you think was truly the deadliest, and why. Was it the technologically superior Tiger, the numerically overwhelming T-34, or something else entirely? The debate continues, just as it has since 1945, and that's fitting. These weren't just machines. They were the instruments through which millions of men fought and died, and their stories are worth telling again and again.